The scent of wood smoke and damp moss lingers softly in the stillness tonight. Let it curl around your senses like the memory of an old forgotten lullaby, one that once rose with the wind between pine trees and vanished into the hush of snowfall. Breathe in the calm and let the cold edge of another time touch your skin like a distant dream. In the year 834, beneath the frost-stained skies of Midgard's northern edge, a boy named Eric was born under the hour of the wolf moon, a time when the old women of the village said dreams were at their most fragile and most dangerous. His mother had gone into labor not long after the village's seeress had collapsed by the fire pit, whispering strange verses in a tongue none had spoken for generations. They said she had seen something moving through the veil, something with no name. Eric would not know this story until many winters later, but already the hush of that night shaped him. He grew in a village that slept lightly, not just from the cold, but from the knowledge that dreams could twist like wind-blown smoke. Men whispered of rules, unspoken ones, handed down not through words, but through rituals, glances, the silence that followed certain questions. No child was told outright what not to dream, but every child learned. Eirik's village was called Skjoldheim, Shield Home, built in a cold cradle between the sea cliffs and the shadow of the ash forest. It was not a large place, but it endured, as the old ones said, by sleeping carefully. Dreams, they believed, were not just shadows of thought, but pathways. Open roads walked by the wandering dead, by old gods half forgotten, and by those who had no business walking among either. The rules, though unspoken, held firm. Never fall asleep with a borrowed blade beneath your pillow. Never speak the name of a dream aloud before breakfast. And never, under any season, carve the rune for dream, into wood, stone, or bone. It was not forbidden because it summoned evil, they said, but because it invited it to linger. The dream rune was a tether, and anything drawn to it could follow it back. Eirik heard these things not from teaching, but in the rhythm of living. He saw how his grandmother burned certain herbs only on moonless nights, and how the young women whispered prayers into their braids before sleep. The smith's apprentice once carved a series of runes into his workbench to help him remember his dreams. A week later, he wandered naked into the tide and did not return. His name was not spoken again. Even Eirik, still small, understood that silence was not grief. It was protection. Eric's dreams began early. Strange ones, vivid and slow, as if sleep itself was a separate world, and he walked it fully. He told no one. He saw wolves beneath the sea, whispering his name through bubbles. He saw his mother as a child, frightened and small, hiding behind a wall of fish skins. He dreamed of a mountain that breathed in time with the stars, and of a ship carved from ice that moved without wind. But he never told. He had seen the way people shifted when others spoke of dreams. Their eyes grew careful, their voices slower. To speak of dreams was to carry them into waking life. To tell someone a dream was to offer it as a gift or a burden. He kept his silence for many years, tending goats in summer, mending nets in winter. He was neither the strongest nor the swiftest, but he listened, and in a village like Skjoldheim, that counted for more than most knew. Old Bjarka, the woodcutter, once said that Eirik had the quiet of a man twice his age, which meant either he would become a wise elder or be taken by the sea before his beard grew in. It was in his 15th winter, during the dark months when the sea froze near the shore and even the wolves fell silent, that the dream changed. This time, it was no place he recognized, no sea, no mountain, no voice, only a hall, long, roofless, and empty. The floor was carved with runes, all glowing faintly beneath drifting snow. At the far end sat a woman whose face flickered, young, old, dead, living. Her eyes were silver. She did not speak, but lifted one hand and pointed to the floor between them. Carved there was the rune for dream, drum, and beneath it, a second rune, one he did not know. He woke with a mouthful of salt and the taste of ash on his tongue. He said nothing for 3 days, but dreams pressed like cold against skin, persistent and biting. He found himself walking in circles during chores, hearing whispers and the bleating of goats, staring at the ice long after his reflection had faded. On the 4th night, he could not sleep. He sat outside the longhouse, wrapped in a deer-hide cloak, listening to the distant groan of the ice in the fjord. Snow fell soft as breath. Somewhere nearby, a raven croaked once and flew off. And then he saw her, the seeress. She had not been seen for 2 winters, old enough that most assumed she had crossed the veil. But there she was, walking slowly up the path from the woods, hair full of needles, eyes half closed, as if dreaming while waking. She stopped in front of him, tilted her head, and exhaled a long white cloud of breath. "Did she show you the second rune?" the woman asked, her voice like pine bark under frost. Eric could not speak. She waited, then nodded. "You must not carve it, not yet, not unless the wolf howls inside the flame." Then she walked on and did not look back. He told no one. But that night, he dreamed again. This time the woman in the hall did not point. She stood, and the snow beneath her feet melted. Spring came slowly to Skjoldheim that year. The thaw was late. The sea remained cold and distant, but with each returning bird, Eric felt something rising. Not fear, but a hum behind the ribs. The village returned to life as always. Nets were repaired, boats oiled, axes sharpened. And then one morning, the smith's new apprentice, not the one who vanished, but another younger boy, was found whispering in his sleep. His hands twitched as if carving. When shaken, he woke with blood in his mouth and the name of a dream on his lips. Eirik listened, and for the first time, he began to wonder. What happens not when you break the rules, but when the dream asks you to? There is a hush in the air tonight. Not silence, but something softer. The kind of quiet that drapes over a winter forest just before the first snowfall, when even the wind holds its breath. Let that stillness settle on your shoulders and feel it ease you toward another place, another time, where the fire crackles low and the past breathes like embers. The boy in the smithy had been named Audun, and though he was scarcely past his 12th summer, he was known for remembering every dream he'd ever had. His mother, a healer, called it a gift. The elders called it a danger. He had never spoken of his dreams until that morning, when blood wet his lip and his hands moved as though carving runes in air. When Eric heard this, something cold stirred beneath his ribs. It was not fear. It was recognition. That same day, Eric returned to the spot where he had first seen the old seeress, where the snow had fallen like breath and the raven had flown westward. He sat there again, deer-hide cloak wrapped tight, and waited. The sun dipped low. Shadows stretched long, but no one came. Still, he stayed. As night folded in, the wind turned, and with it came the scent of ash and marrow. Not the scent of firewood, but the scent of something older, more intimate, like the burned bone of a funeral pyre or the underside of charred earth. He stood slowly and walked into the woods. The trees there were ancient, twisted into shapes that seemed to remember things long lost. Some still bore the scars of carved runes, faded now, their meanings worn thin by time. These were safe runes, for good harvest, for healthy births, for ships to return whole, but none bore drum. The dream rune was forbidden even by the trees. Eirik moved deeper, careful not to step on roots. The deeper he walked, the quieter the forest grew, until even his breath felt loud. Then in a small clearing haloed by frost-covered ferns, he found it. A stone, upright and weathered, half swallowed by moss and earth. On its surface, faint and worn, were two runes. The first was drum. The second was the one from his dream. He knelt. He traced the carvings with a finger. Have you ever touched something that felt like it remembered being touched before? The stone was cold, yes, but it thrummed beneath his skin. A subtle vibration, like the echo of someone speaking far beneath the ground. He pulled his hand away and whispered, "Why me?" No voice answered, but the wind shifted, and in that shift came memory, not his, but something deeper. A fragment of understanding. The second rune, he realized, was not just a mark. It was a name not spoken, a name that was a door. That night, he did not sleep. The next day, the villagers whispered of Audun. He had vanished. One moment he was tying bundles of birch twigs with his mother by the stream, and the next he was gone. No footsteps, no cry, only a circle of melted snow where he'd last stood. Some blamed the wolves. Some quietly blamed the dreams. Eirik said nothing, but in his chest bloomed a certainty, not panic, but a knowing. The second rune had opened something, and Audun had gone through. He began walking the forest each night, not searching, listening, watching for signs. His sleep came in brief intervals, never full, never restful. And when he did sleep, the dream hall returned. The woman was there, but she no longer flickered. She was clear now, her eyes pale as ice under starlight. This time, she spoke. "Not all rules are for your safety," she said. "Some are for their silence." Eirik tried to ask her who they were, but she raised a hand. "You've seen the second rune. It sees you. Do not carve it. Not yet." When he woke, the deer-hide cloak smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire had burned near him. Spring softened the land, but not the unease. People grew cautious. The village sleep became thinner, more fragile. Mothers braided extra charms into their children's hair. The elder Bjarka sharpened a blade he had not touched since the days of sea raids. But there were no ships, no enemies at the shore, only dreams that whispered, too close to waking. One morning, as Eirik returned from his wandering, he found the old seeress waiting by the well. She was weaving something, a strand of bark, a length of hair, a sliver of bone, into a spiral shape. She did not look up when she said, "The boy has crossed." Eirik nodded. "He carved the rune in sleep," she said, "with breath alone. That is all it takes now." Eirik asked what lay beyond it. The seeress stopped weaving. There is a hall, beneath the first tree, beneath the ash whose roots drink the bones of the 9 worlds. In that hall lie dreams unclaimed, dreams too heavy for the dead, too loud for the living. It is not a place for boys. Then why show me? She looked at him for a long time. Because the hall called you before your mother even carried you. Because you are not meant to pass through. You are meant to guard the gate. He swallowed hard. How? She handed him the spiral braid. It was warm in his palm. You will learn. She left again, as she always did, without farewell. Her steps left no mark in the thawing earth. The braid he wore beneath his tunic, close to his chest. That night, he did not sleep at all, but dreams came anyway. This time, the dream did not begin in the hall. It began in the village, in Skjoldheim. But not as it was. It was quiet, still. No smoke from chimneys, no chatter of goats or cries of gulls. Snow fell, though the sky was clear, and in the center of the village stood a tree he had never seen before. Tall, white-barked, and leafless, with runes etched deep into every branch. At its base lay Audun. His eyes were closed, but he smiled, not with joy, with peace. I found it, the boy said, though his lips never moved. I found the dream that breathes. Eric reached out, but his hand passed through the vision like fog. Then he heard the woman's voice again, not aloud, but through the tree itself. You are waking in both worlds now. He jerked awake. The sun had not risen yet, but someone was knocking at the longhouse door. His mother opened it. The man outside was pale. He stammered words about a storm coming, though no clouds had gathered. He said something was moving through the ash forest, and the birds had gone silent. His voice cracked when he spoke of his daughter, who now walked in sleep and whispered runes into the wind. Eric stepped forward, not because he knew what to say, but because something within him was already listening to something far beyond the door. That evening, as the fire crackled low, and his mother stirred the evening stew, he pulled the spiral braid from beneath his tunic. He unwound it. Inside was a sliver of bark, ash bark, carved with the first rune, drum, and beneath it, the second. He knew what must be done, not to break the rule, but to understand why it had been made, and what happened when you were chosen to hold it anyway. The night carries a different weight when no creatures stir. Even the smallest hush can feel like a voice waiting to be heard. Let yourself drift into that weight now, not heavy, but cradling, like the softness of snow just before it falls. Tonight, we return to Skjoldheim, where the dreams are shifting, and the old rules no longer sleep so soundly. The sliver of bark in Eric's palm was warm again, as if it held a faint breath, something slow, ancient, not quite asleep. The runes carved into it felt deeper than they appeared, as if the marks themselves reached down into something older than wood. He kept the bark hidden inside his tunic for 3 more nights. Each evening, he unwound the braid and stared at the carvings, never speaking, never tracing them again with his fingers. It wasn't fear that stilled his hand. It was reverence, and something else, an intuition that the bark was listening. The 4th night, the winds returned, not loud, not howling, but murmuring, whispering in the strange cadence of half-forgotten lullabies, the kind that elders hummed under their breath when they stirred stews or mended tunics by firelight, songs that no one quite remembered learning. And within the wind song came a rhythm, a distant drumming, soft and slow, like the sound of a heartbeat through earth. That was when the dreams began to spill. Not only for Eirik, but for the village. The blacksmith woke screaming about wolves with human faces. The baker's son sobbed into his bread dough, muttering about voices that whispered recipes in reverse. Even the goats grew restless, pacing their pens as though hearing footsteps behind the wind. Eirik's mother, Solveig, was among the first to grow silent. Not the quiet of grief or fatigue, but the kind of quiet that holds back a tide. She no longer stirred the fire with her usual rhythm, nor spoke the small phrases that mothers in Skjoldheim murmured to anchor the world. Eat while it's warm, or mind the kettle, or the storm will pass. Instead, she stared often into the hearth, her lips moving in silence, as though trying to remember a word she dare not speak aloud. Eric watched her, and something within him braced. The world, he thought, was leaning, not falling, but tipping slowly toward something unseen. On the sixth night, a raven landed on the longhouse roof. It did not caw. It did not move. It simply sat, watching. And the seventh night, the dream returned. He stood once again in the snow-hushed hall. The roof above had vanished, revealing a starless sky that pulsed as though breathing. The woman with silver eyes waited by the far wall, but she no longer flickered. Her skin was marked now, not with runes, but with patterns like bark, layered and spiraled, as if she too had been carved by time. This time, she spoke only a name, not his. Solveig. Eric's chest tightened. The silver-eyed woman raised her hand, and in her palm appeared a sprig of ash leaves, turning slowly, though no wind touched them. She dreams as they once did, as you do now. But she remembers the rules too well. What rules? Eric whispered. His voice sounded distant in the dream hall, like an echo that didn't quite belong to him. She knows not to speak, not to carve, not to tell, but sometimes silence feeds the wrong side. The leaves disintegrated into ash in her hand. She is the doorway, the woman said, and the dream is knocking. Eric woke with tears already on his face. The hearth had gone out. The longhouse was colder than it should have been, and Solveig was no longer beside the fire. Outside, the sky was filled with moving cloud shadows, fast and low, as if something huge moved behind them. No storm came, no thunder rolled, but the night itself seemed to press down, as though waiting for a choice to be made. He followed his mother's footsteps, light, but still visible in the soft loam between house and forest. The trail led not to the fields, nor to the stream, but into the ashwood, the oldest part of the forest, where the trees grew close and the air held a memory of burning, even when no fires had touched it. The moonlight followed reluctantly, threading faint silver through the branches as Eric passed beneath them. He found her in the grove, the same clearing where the stone stood. She sat cross-legged before it, eyes closed, whispering. Her hands rested on her knees, palms up, as if offering the air a question. Eric stayed still, barely breathing. Her voice was soft, but it echoed through the stone and trees, threading into the bark as though the forest itself listened. "I dreamed before I knew how," she murmured. "Dreamed when my mother carried me. Dreamed when the storm took my brother. Dreamed when your father sailed and did not return." A pause. "I kept the rules. I fed them to you in silence. I buried the names, but the root remembers." Eric took a step forward. A twig snapped. Solveig opened her eyes slowly, and in the moonlight, he saw that they were damp, not from tears, but from dew, as if she had been breathing with the forest itself. "You saw it," she said gently. "Didn't you?" He nodded. "The hall, the woman, the second rune." She exhaled, not with fear, but with the relief of being named. "They showed me once," she said, "but I turned away." "Why?" "Because I was afraid of remembering." The bark scrap inside Eric's tunic grew hot against his chest. What does the second rune mean? He asked, voice low. Solveig did not answer immediately. She stood slowly, walked to the standing stone, and touched its surface with a reverent palm. It means the between, she whispered. The breath between sleep and waking. The shore between life and not. It is not a word. It is an opening. It does not name. It invites. She turned back to him, the moonlight silvering her face. And once carved, it can never be uncarved. Eric pulled the spiral braid from his tunic, unwrapped it again, and held the sliver of bark between them. I didn't carve it, he said, but it's here. She took it from him, hands shaking slightly. The forest gives what it remembers. Then what happens now? Solveig closed her eyes, breathed in the damp air. The village will dream deeper. Too deep if we let it. There is still time to hold the door shut, but not for long. From somewhere deeper in the woods, a soft hum began, a low, pulsing tone, almost like a chant. It rose and fell gently, like the breath of something buried, but not dead. We must go, she said, not away, inward. She placed the bark sliver against the stone. It adhered, though no force held it there. The runes glowed faintly, just for a moment, then dimmed, and the forest exhaled. A sudden wind rolled through the trees, not cold, not sharp, but purposeful. Leaves fluttered upward instead of down. Small lights flickered between trunks, too slow to be fireflies, too restless to be spirits. Eric felt something shift, in the roots, in the sky, in himself. They walked back together, not speaking. That night, no dreams came. Not to Eric, not to the villagers, not even to the goats. It was not sleep, it was pause. And in that pause, something watched. There is a sound that only arrives when all others have ceased. Not quite a silence, but a space between. A hush that seems to hover just above the skin, as if listening to your thoughts before you've spoken them. Settle into that space now. Let it hold you like dusk holds the last light over the fjord. This is where we begin again. Morning came to Skjoldheim with an unnatural calm. The snow, which had lingered too long into spring, melted overnight. Not in trickles or patches, but in wide, even strokes, as though a great warm hand had swept over the land while no one watched. The sea thawed to a glassy stillness, and the birds returned, not gradually, but all at once, cawing and spiraling in great arcs above the rooftops as if startled by their own arrival. But it was not joy that filled the villagers' faces. It was wariness. They knew that when things moved too quickly in the north, it was seldom a gift. Eric felt it too, in the weight of his limbs, the ache behind his eyes, a strange fatigue that came not from lack of sleep, but from too many nights where rest had meant something else. Since the night in the woods, he had not dreamed, and yet each morning he woke with the faint scent of ash on his breath and a distant ringing in his ears, like a bell struck beneath the earth. His mother, Solveig, had returned to her daily work with the same deliberate grace she'd always carried, but something in her posture had changed. She bent her head less, looked people longer in the eye. When the neighbors asked about the weather or the sudden silence of dreams, she answered with only soft sayings. Some winds sleep before they rise. Or, the sea is not still, only waiting. People listened to her words the way one watches a firelight flicker, unsure whether to feel comfort or concern. That afternoon, Eric walked to the western edge of the village, where the cliffs met the sea. It was the place his father had often stood before, leaving on the last voyage, the one from which he never returned. The rocks were dark with salt and bird droppings, But beneath them, wildflowers had begun to bud early, their colors defiant against the cold. He sat there for a long time listening, and he began to hum, a melody he did not recognize, soft and slow, like the tune of an old cradle song. It did not come from memory. It came from somewhere else, from the quiet beyond the dreams. As he hummed, a wind rose, not strong, not cruel, but deliberate. And in that wind, Eric felt something shift in the bones of the land, a presence that leaned closer, not to harm, but to see. Later that evening, when he returned to the longhouse, his mother was already waiting. The fire burned low. Her hands were folded. "They're coming," she said, her voice not frightened, but resolved. Eric stood very still. "Who?" "Not people," she said. "Not gods either. Something older, older than names." She looked at him. "The ones who walked the dreams before language was shaped." He felt the truth of it settle into his chest. "They aren't angry," she said softly. "They're curious." That night, the villagers gathered near the center of Skjoldheim. No one had called them, but still they came, carrying lamps, baskets, charms, small blades, children half asleep in arms. It was as though the whole village had heard the same whisper and moved without question. Old Bjarke stood beside the well, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Something's moving," he muttered to no one in particular. The air was warmer than it should have been, the breeze gentle, but with an edge, like fingers brushing the inside of your collar, searching. And then Solveig stepped forward. She did not raise her voice, but everyone heard. "The dreams have thinned, but the thread holds. We are not the first to forget the path between waking and sleep, but we are the first in many winters to be remembered." The villagers shifted uneasily. Bjarke cleared his throat. "Are you saying the dreams are watching us now?" Solveig met his eyes. They always were. She held up the spiral braid Eric had once worn, now unbound, the bark scrap nestled in its center like a seed. "The rune has returned, the one we buried beneath rules." A murmur ran through the people. "No one's carved it," someone said. "That's not the point," another answered. Eric stepped forward. He didn't know he was going to speak until he did. "They're not asking to be worshipped," he said slowly. "Not even to be followed. They're asking if we remember, if we still know how to listen." A quiet fell like snow. Then Solveig looked around and said one final thing before turning away. "Stay close tonight. And don't sleep near metal." That evening, the lamps in Skjoldheim burned longer than usual. The children were restless. The animals pawed at doors and gates, unsettled by something they could not smell. But no storms came. No nightmares clawed their way through the thatch. Instead, something older happened. Around midnight, the dreams began to return. But not as before. Not personal, not broken and scattered like so many fading visions. These were collective, shared. Eric dreamed of the same stone he had touched in the forest, but this time it stood in the village square, and every villager stood around it, their faces turned toward a sky full of silver threads, swaying like branches underwater. He dreamed of Solveig, speaking in a language that hummed rather than echoed, her voice joining others in layered harmony, forming not sentences, but intentions. He dreamed of wolves sleeping peacefully beside children, of iron melting into soil and blooming into ash trees, of a mountain unfolding like a book. And when he woke, his pillow was wet, not with sweat or tears, but with the faint glisten of morning dew. Across the village, others woke the same, calm, quiet, still. But something had changed. The blacksmith stepped outside and found that all the tools in his forge had rusted overnight, not sharply, but softly, as though time had breathed over them with care. The baker found her kneading table carved with runes she had not made and could not understand. But somehow, she knew they meant something good. And the goats? They slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Eric sat beside the hearth with Solveig, watching the flames. They walked through, she said, but they didn't stay. He nodded. Because we remembered. She smiled faintly. For now. He looked at the bark again, now wrapped in linen and resting in a small wooden box near the fire. What do we do with it? Solveig stirred the ashes with a stick, watching the embers rise like fireflies. We keep it, not as a weapon, not as a shrine, just a reminder. She paused. And when the dreams change again, we listen? Outside, a soft drizzle began to fall, pattering gently against the roof, threading through the thatch like a lullaby. The kind of rain that does not soak or chill, but sings the world back to stillness. Eirik closed his eyes, and for the first time in many moons, he dreamed without fear. There is a kind of warmth that lingers even in the cold, not from fire, but from memory. A warmth that settles in the bones like a song once heard in childhood, soft and wordless, but never quite forgotten. Let it settle over you now as the world slows. The sea hushes, and Skjoldheim breathes again. The rain had fallen lightly through the night, threading the thatch, darkening the earth, and waking the worms. By morning, the air smelled of moss and wet stone, of fish drying in smokehouses, of the slow, patient hands of the season turning its wheel. Yet beneath the scent of spring, something older still stirred. Not sharp, not threatening, but steady, the kind of presence that waited. Eric woke slowly, as if returning from a distant shore. His limbs were heavy, not from weariness, but from weight, the weight of a dream not yet fully left behind. He sat up and blinked toward the soft glow of the hearth, where Solveig had left the fire murmuring low. The small wooden box containing the bark scrap rested on the table beside it, wrapped again in linen, its presence quiet but insistent, like a heartbeat behind a door. He dressed without speaking and stepped outside. The village was already stirring. Birds flitted between thatched roofs. Old Bjarka was sharpening a blade with deliberate strokes, pausing now and then to glance at the clouds. The baker's wife, whose dreams had once been filled with ash and screams, now hummed softly as she dusted flour across her table. Even the dogs, long skittish, lay curled in the sun, their ears relaxed. It would be easy, Eric thought, to believe that the strange nights had passed, that the rules had held, that the old dreams had stepped away again, satisfied. But easy thoughts did not last long in Skjoldheim. By midday, word spread that the stream had changed direction. Not all of it, just the narrow branch that twisted behind the grove near the stone. It now ran, eastward, toward the sea. No storm had redirected it. No flood had carved a new channel. It had simply turned. Several villagers went to look. They found the water clearer than before, cold as bone, humming faintly when cupped in the hand. And at the bend where it veered, small spirals of stone had surfaced from beneath the soil. Runes, old ones, not carved, but grown, like frost patterns on glass. That night, Solveig did not light the hearth. Instead, she brought out a bowl carved of whalebone, filled it with oil, and placed a single thread from the spiral braid into it. The flame, when it took, burned blue. Eric watched her. "Why tonight?" he asked. "Because they haven't left," she said quietly. "They've only stopped knocking." The fire cast long, slow shadows across the walls. No crackle, only a steady hiss, like rain falling on warm stone. They sat beside it in silence until the oil had nearly burned down. Then Solveig spoke. "There was a time," she said, "before the longhouses and the forge fires, before the boats with dragon prows, when we did not speak the dreams, but lived among them." Eric said nothing. "We sang with them," she continued, "wove them into hair, carved them into bark, offered them to the snow. But the world turned faster. We needed more from the day. So we bound the night, and with it, the dreams." She looked at him. "You were born under the wolf moon. Do you know what that means?" He nodded. "They said it's when dreams are strongest." "It's when the dreams watch back," she corrected gently. Eric felt a cold settle in his stomach. Not fear, not dread, but reverence. "Then why are they stirring now?" Solveig exhaled. "Because someone has remembered." That night, he dreamed again. But this time, it was not the hall. It was the sea. He stood upon the shore, windless and vast. The waves did not break. They simply breathed, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping creature. Upon the water, ships drifted. Not Viking longships, but vessels older than wood, formed of woven mist and memory. They bore no sail, only shadows. One ship came close enough for Eric to see a figure aboard it. Tall, robed in starlight, face obscured by drifting hair like kelp in a current. The figure raised a hand and pointed to the sand at Eric's feet. There, etched not by hand but by tide, was the second rune, and beside it, for the first time, a third. He knelt, reached toward the symbols, but as his fingers touched them, the dream split. A howl tore through the sea, not of pain, not of rage, but of awakening. He woke with his hand pressed flat to the floor, as though he'd been bracing against a wave. The wooden planks beneath him were damp, and in the faint light of dawn, he saw it. 2 runes, the same as the dream, carved into the floorboards. Shallow, fresh, he did not remember carving them. And yet, he did not feel afraid. He stepped outside. The sky was gray, but soft. Clouds low, but not heavy. The wind smelled of juniper and moss. Old Bjarke was at the well, tossing stones into the bucket before drawing it up again, as if testing the water's patience. He looked up at Eirik, eyes sharp. "You feel it too?" Eric nodded. "Yes." The old man grunted. "I've seen seasons shift. I've seen winters crack trees like bones, but I've never seen a boy walk out of a dream and into the village like it was a hallway." Eric blinked. "I didn't—" Bjarke raised a hand. "You didn't need to. We saw you. The light, the sound, the marks on your mother's door." Eric turned. The lintel above the longhouse door bore faint soot prints now. Not symbols, not letters, but shapes like branching roots. He hadn't seen them before. "They're gathering," Bjarke said. "Who?" The old man looked at him sideways. "The ones who still remember. The ones who buried the runes in blood and bark. The ones who kept the rules not out of fear, but out of duty." He dropped the bucket, water sloshing over the side. "It's time you met them." Later that day, Solveig led Eric beyond the edge of the village, through the ashwood paths. Few walked after dusk. The air there felt denser, not heavy, but aware, as though each tree recognized them and watched their passing with slow green memory. They came to a hollow ringed in stone. Moss draped the stones like old cloaks. In the center stood 3 figures, women, elderly, not frail. Their backs were straight, eyes sharp, hair braided in patterns that mimicked tree roots and water eddies. They wore no charms, no symbols, only quiet. They said nothing as Solveig approached. One stepped forward and studied Eric. "So," she said, "you carry the seed." Eric swallowed. "The bark." "The echo," she corrected. "The rune is not the mark. It is the memory you have remembered." Another elder gestured to the hollow ground. "Kneel." He did. They stood around him, and each placed a hand on his shoulders. Not heavy, but firm. "Do you accept what follows when you carry what sleeps?" Eric nodded. "Do you listen not only to dreams, but to silence?" "Yes." "Do you remember that the rules were never meant to protect you, but to prepare you?" He hesitated, then said, "I do now." The third woman leaned close, and for a moment he thought he saw her face shift. Young, old, child, crone, like the woman in his earliest dream. "Then we will tell you the truth of the third rune." Eric held his breath. They spoke not in words, but in sound. Layered, low, a harmony of breath and bone, echo and heartbeat. The ground beneath him vibrated, the trees leaned inward, the air hummed, and something inside him unfolded. A memory not his own, a thread unbroken for centuries. A truth buried so deep it had become a rhythm in the blood. The third rune was not an ending. It was a return. There are certain winds that do not stir the trees, and yet they move through you as though you were nothing but tall grass beneath their path. A wind like that brushes against you now, slow, ancient, almost affectionate. Let it guide you into the dusk light world, where stories do not end, but fold inwards, curling softly like the smoke of the hearth. Let us return. The hollow beneath the ashwood had grown quiet again, but Eric's breath still trembled with the sound the elders had made. Not words, not a chant, not even song, but something older, a note that resonated not in the ears, but in the spine, the marrow, the teeth. The third rune was not spoken to him. It was placed in him. He did not leave the hollow, changed in the way a person grows older or wiser. He left the way a stone does after centuries of water pass over it. Smoother, heavier, remembering without trying. Solveig said little as they walked home. But when they reached the edge of the village, she laid a hand on his shoulder and said, "You'll start to feel it now. The pull. It's not a task. It's a tide." He asked her softly, "What do I do when it pulls?" She answered without pause, "You follow." That night, the village was restless, not with fear, but with unease, like children hearing the wind rearrange the roof thatch and not knowing if it meant rain or stories. Lamps burned later. The doors closed softly but did not latch. People sat at their tables long after eating, listening not to anything in particular, but with the stillness of waiting. Eirik sat beside the fire with the linen-wrapped bark in his lap. He did not open it. He simply rested his hands upon it and breathed. And in the hearthlight, his fingers began to tingle. Not with heat, with memory. From somewhere in his mind, or perhaps not entirely his, came a vision. The same village, but in the bones of another time. The same longhouses, but newer. The same paths, but lined with stone markers now long buried. And people, different, but familiar, singing runes into the ground before sleep. They did not write them, they sang them. The next morning, he woke with a word upon his tongue, a sound like breath drawn over birch bark. He whispered it aloud, not trying to understand it, only to remember its shape. And somewhere across the village, a child laughed in her sleep. The dreams had changed, not vanished, not faded, changed. They no longer came with riddles or storms, but with threads, quiet threads of sound and image, braided not with fear, but with invitation. One man dreamed of his dead brother baking bread beside him, not ghostly, but warm, cheerful, covered in flour. An elder dreamed of walking through a forest that hummed his name, each tree bowing slightly as he passed. Even Bjarka, gruff and hardened, confessed that he dreamed of a younger self, teaching his father how to tie fishing knots, something that had never happened, but which filled him with a quiet joy. Eirik listened to each of these dreams. He didn't interpret them. He held them, and the village began to treat him differently, not as a seer, not as a leader, but as something gentler, a vessel. He was where the dreams came to be heard. One evening, as dusk settled like mist along the eaves, Solveig brought him a small bundle wrapped in worn wool. Inside was a shard of bone, aged, yellowed, smooth from handling. She placed it in his hand and said only, "Your father left this for you." Eirik turned it gently. On one side, faint but visible, was the second rune, the one from his earliest dreams, the one he had never dared carve. It was etched not with a blade, but with fire. Solveig sat beside him and said, after a long pause, "He dreamed deep too, but he never spoke of it. He thought it might break him." "Did it?" She gave a sad smile. "It broke his silence, but not his self." Eirik closed his hand around the bone. That night, he slept beside the hearth and dreamed of waves, not breaking, not crashing, but circling. Each wave bore a rune upon its crest, and as it curled and fell, the rune changed. He understood none of them, but he recognized them all. And then came the door, a great stone threshold beneath the sea, rimmed with coral and light, pulsing faintly like the gills of a great fish. It opened, not by touch, but by recognition. And beyond it, a tunnel of water that did not drown, but lifted. He swam, but he was not swimming. He was being pulled. At the end of the tunnel stood the woman, the silver-eyed one from the first dream, now clearer than ever. Her cloak was made of stitched leaves, some green, some blackened. Her mouth did not move, but her voice arrived anyway. "Now you know the third." Eirik opened his hands in the dream. The runes hovered there, all three. She nodded once. "But the fourth is not to be given. It is to be earned." He wanted to ask what it was, but she was already fading. He woke with water in his hair, and a word carved into the soot of the hearthstone. Not a word from their tongue, a shape, a thread. Later that morning, Solveig found him staring at it. She said nothing at first. Then, "It's begun." "What has?" "The weaving." The rest of the week passed, not in event, but in presence. The village became softer. The goats gave more milk. The fishermen returned early without losing nets. The stream continued to hum faintly, and sometimes in the early mist, people said they saw figures on its surface, walking, not floating, watching, not haunting. And every night, the dreams came. Sometimes strange, sometimes peaceful, always threaded, and always remembered. On the seventh night, Eirik stood at the edge of the forest again. This time, he was not searching. He was returning. The hollow waited, unchanged. But the elders were not there. Instead, in the center stood a mirror, not of glass, but of still water, held in a frame of root and bone. He stepped toward it and saw himself, not as he was, but as he would become. A man with bark on his arms, thread in his fingers, light in his voice. He touched the water, and the fourth rune revealed itself, not carved, but woven, a spiral, a return, a beginning again. Tonight, there's a faint scent of pine resin rising in the still air, as if somewhere nearby, sap has cracked and warmed inside a hollow tree. It lingers at the edge of your thoughts, sweet and smoky, the way firewood does before it burns. Let that scent carry you inward now, to a place where breath is slow and the world speaks in symbols older than sound. The water mirror in the hollow did not ripple when Eric touched it. It turned to ash, not in a rush, not in heat, but slowly, like time peeling away a memory. The reflection dissolved into fine, pale dust that rose into the windless air and hung there, forming no shape at all. Yet as it drifted, he knew something had changed. Not in the forest, not even in the village. Within him. He stepped back from the frame, and where the mirror had stood, a small bundle now rested, wrapped in linen the color of old snow, tied with a simple knot made of hair. His own. He hadn't cut it, he hadn't given it. But the knot was unmistakable. He picked it up with careful hands. Inside was a single object, a smooth, round stone the size of his palm, marked with a spiral so faint it could barely be seen unless tilted toward the light. It was warm, not hot, but holding the exact temperature of his own skin, as if it had been waiting to return to him. That night, he did not dream. But in the morning, the hearth fire lit itself. Solveig did not speak when he showed her the stone. She took it in her hands and held it against her forehead, whispering words in a cadence he had never heard before. Not language, not prayer. More like breath, given rhythm. The kind of rhythm the forest made when it wasn't trying to be heard. She handed it back without a word, and so began the season of weaving. Not literal weaving, though baskets and nets continued to be made and threads spun from sheep's wool, but the weaving of sound, of silence, of meaning. People began to speak their dreams again, but softly, without fear, as though knowing they were not alone in their stories, and not just to Eric, but to one another. The village changed, not in shape, not in size, but in depth. Conversations lengthened without aim. Children sang old songs in new ways. Small offerings began to appear at the base of certain trees. Stones with markings, braids of river grass, bits of bone etched faintly. They were not worshiping. They were remembering. Eric began to feel the spiral inside him, not as a burden, as a compass. The dreams no longer pulled him outward, to the sea, or the hall, or the grove. They began to turn inward, each one folding into the next, looping gently back through the images of his own life. The sound of his mother's voice in winter, the texture of worn leather, the way his father once adjusted a cloak's clasp with quiet hands. It wasn't nostalgia. It was instruction. He saw how things held meaning in the way they were held. A blade, a thread, a silence, and how the holding was part of the rune, a part that could never be carved, only known. One night, he awoke to find the village utterly still. No wind, no owl calls. Even the fire had gone out in its hearth. He stepped outside and saw them. Figures? Not many. Just 3. Standing in the field, lit only by the moon, their forms barely outlined by the frost collecting on their cloaks. He did not move. He did not call out. One of them raised a hand, not in greeting, in recognition. And then, they were gone. He stood there a long time, heart steady, not racing. They had not come to test him. They had come to mark a turning. The next morning, Solveig handed him a small pouch. Inside was nothing. At least nothing he could see. She smiled. It's where the fifth rune will go. He blinked. There's a fifth? There is always a fifth. He carried the pouch with him from then on, tied to the cord at his belt, its empty weight somehow reassuring. That day, while walking the ridge that overlooked the fjord, he found a girl sitting on a stone. She was young, maybe 10 winters. Her hair long and tangled with feathers. He didn't recognize her. But she looked at him with the ease of someone who already knew him. You have it now, she said. He paused. What? The rune that hums, she said, pointing to his chest. I heard it in my dream. It sounded like bees underwater. He smiled despite himself. That's a good sound. She nodded seriously. It made the trees dance, but only the ones with roots that remember. And then she hopped off the rock and ran into the woods. When he told Solveig, she said only, It begins in children. Always. Spring faded into summer, and the nights grew shorter, but no less strange. More people spoke of shared dreams, not always identical, but overlapping, like stories heard through a wall. A farmer saw herself planting seeds in the riverbed, while a fisher dreamt of fish with leaves instead of fins. A widow dreamed of her late husband placing a braid of sunlight in her lap. None of it was frightening. All of it was real. Not true, but real in the way that songs are real, or the way grief lives behind the eyes. One evening, a boy carved a spiral into the side of the well. The next day, the water tasted faintly of honey. That night, Eric slept without the stone. Instead, he placed it in the empty pouch, the one for the fifth rune. And he dreamed of fire, but not destruction. He dreamed of fire teaching wood how to speak, of fire curling into smoke, then into song. And in the flames, a spiral turned, not outward, but inward, into something still being made. When he woke, the pouch was warm, and inside it, something waited, but it did not yet speak. There's a feeling, just before a dream returns, like mist forming on skin. Barely there, not yet a touch, but something known. Tonight, that feeling settles around you, a hush that isn't silence, but expectation. Let it guide you gently into the turning world of Skjoldheim, where the fifth rune has yet to speak, and yet it is already listening. The pouch was warm, not in a way that burned or even comforted, but in the quiet manner of something alive, not pulsing, not breathing, just present, as though whatever it held had once had a name, but let it go, like snow letting go of the branch at first thaw. Eric did not open it. He carried it with him, always, but he never peeked inside, because something in him knew. The fifth rune would not show itself to sight. Not yet. It would unfold when it was ready, and not before. That was the difference between a rune drawn from memory and one born of remembering. By midsummer, the villagers had begun to mark time differently. They no longer counted the days between storms or fish hauls or goat births. Instead, they counted the dreams. They spoke of nights in spirals, like rings of an ash tree. It has been 6 dreams since the wind changed. Or, I've had 3 quiet dreams since Solveig sang to the stream. And the dreams continued to weave them, not apart, but together. One evening, Eric sat near the stream that had changed direction, still flowing east, still humming faintly, when a young man approached. His name was Halvar, the blacksmith's nephew, sharp-eyed and restless. I dreamed of you last night, Halvar said without greeting. Eric looked up. Was I wearing feathers or fire? Halvar smirked. Neither. You were sleeping, and your shadow was awake. Eric blinked. What did it do? It walked the length of the fjord, spoke to stones, asked them what they remembered. Halvor sat beside him. One answered. It said, "He carries the spiral that eats its own mouth." They sat together in the quiet after that, watching the stream move as though pushed by breath alone. Later that night, Solveig placed her hand on Eric's shoulder and said, "The shadow dreams are coming more often." "I've noticed," he said softly. "They're the ones that don't follow the rules, not even the old ones." "Should we be worried?" She shook her head. "Number just, still." The following morning, Eric walked to the forest's edge again, not to seek, not even to listen, but to offer. He stood where the ash trees leaned into one another like elders in soft conversation, and he laid the pouch on a flat stone at their feet. He whispered only this: "I don't ask you to show me. I ask you to trust me." Then he turned and walked away. He did not check if the pouch was taken. That night, he dreamed without sleep. Have you ever been so deeply inside a moment that it wrapped around you like wool? Not memory, not imagination, but presence, so complete that it no longer needs a name? That's what it was like. The world was dark, but not empty. And in that darkness, a single thread of gold floated, unspooling slowly. Eric reached for it, not with hands, but with understanding. And when he touched it, the thread began to hum. Not music, more like origin. And around that hum, the spiral turned, not outward, not inward, but through. He woke with a word in his mouth he could not pronounce. It tasted of smoke and marrow. He did not speak it aloud, but the wind did. It whispered the sound as it moved through the trees, repeating it again and again, not to announce, but to remind. The next day, a new carving appeared on the stone in the grove. It was not one Eric had made, but it was the fifth rune. He recognized it not by its shape, for it had no corners, no lines, but by its presence. It did not sit on the stone. It breathed through it. And when he touched it, he felt the hum from the dream rise into his fingertips, travel to his ribs, and settle in his chest like a slow heartbeat. The rune was awake, and it knew him. He knelt before the stone for a long time, not praying, not thinking, just being. The way the trees were, the way dreams were before they had endings. That evening, Solveig came to him by the fire and said, "It's time." He looked up. "For what?" "To tell them." Eric hesitated. "Tell them what?" "That the rules have changed." He stood slowly. "Not broken," she added, "not discarded, but transformed." And so, beneath the midsummer moon, the villagers gathered. No one was called. No horn was blown. They came as if summoned by the breath of the land itself. Children clung to their mothers' cloaks. Men folded arms across chests. Women held hands, loosely, like threads unknotted. Eric stood in the center, the pouch in his hand once more. He opened it. It was empty. Of course it was. The rune did not need to be held anymore. It had already been planted. He did not speak like a chieftain. He did not raise his voice. He simply began. There were rules, once, to protect us, to keep the dreams in their place, to keep waking life clear and safe. He turned slowly, looking into the faces he had known since birth. They weren't wrong, those rules, but they were incomplete. A long silence. Dreams don't only enter us, we enter them, and they remember. He reached into the pouch and withdrew nothing, but the people saw something there. A shimmer, a shape not yet formed, a possibility. The fifth rune has no mark, because it doesn't ask to be read, it asks to be lived. He stepped forward. It is the breath between the rules, the spiral that neither begins nor ends, the place where sleep and waking share the same sky. More silence, but not empty. Listening, silence. The fifth rune is choice, he said. It is offering. He walked through them then, not out of ceremony, but because the path opened, naturally, as though the village already understood. They parted without speaking, letting him pass, the way trees bend for wind. That night, every fire burned low but steady. Every dream came gently, and the fifth rune passed through each sleeper like a thread through cloth, unnoticed but permanent. The next morning, Eric stood by the stream again. The water ran clear. The hum had softened, like a song reaching its last verse. And across the far bank, something stirred. Not a shadow, not a figure, just a possibility. He did not wave. He did not approach. He only listened. And the wind, passing through the grass, whispered something so soft he could not hear it with ears. But he knew. The sixth rune was already forming, and it would not come from him. There's a moment just before dawn when the world holds its breath, not out of fear, but reverence for the stillness, for the turning, for the quiet promise that comes before light. Rest in that breath now, and let your thoughts drift like early mist across an open field. The dreams are waiting, soft and unbound, ready to walk with you again. The sixth rune came not as a sound, nor a vision, but as a silence so deep that it altered everything it touched. It did not arrive with Eric. It arrived with the girl. No one knew her name. No one had seen her before. She appeared at the edge of the stream one afternoon in late summer, standing barefoot on the stones, watching the water flow as if it were telling her a secret. Her hair was long, dark, tangled with moss and threads of river grass. Her dress was stitched from pieces of linen so old they no longer held color, only texture, a patchwork of wear and memory. She did not speak, not at first, but every person who saw her, even before she raised her eyes, felt the hush, a hush that was not fear, but recognition. Eric was in the ashwood when she came. He felt the silence move through the trees, not pressingly, but like the first flake of snow falling through green branches. He turned toward the village and walked without hurry, already knowing something had shifted. When he reached the stream, she was still there. She looked up as he approached, but not with awe, not with deference. Her gaze met his like a mirror made of water. Then she said softly, "You've carried the first 5. It was not a question. Eric nodded. "And you?" "I was born from the 6th. The air did not stir, but somehow the leaves along the bank began to turn. Not in fall's usual rhythm, they did not dry or curl, but lightened, as if they'd remembered another season underneath this one. Eric stepped closer, carefully. "The 6 doesn't have a shape." The girl nodded. "Because it doesn't need one." He looked down at her feet, planted gently on the stone. A faint spiral of water circled her ankles, but the current itself was not moving. It was resting around her. "Where did you come from?" he asked. She tilted her head as though considering the limits of his question. "From between," she said. "Between what?" "Between the moment the 5th finished and the one where you asked what followed." He felt the words land in his chest like soft stones on still water. One after another, each forming a ripple that echoed further than sound. She looked toward the hills then, toward the ridgeline above Skjoldheim. "It will wake soon," she said. "What will?" "The question you buried," she replied. the one the runes can't answer. That evening, the sky turned a shade deeper than twilight, not darker, but more full. The clouds moved in slow, circular patterns, and when the stars emerged, they did not twinkle. They watched. The girl, who still had no name, walked the village without hesitation. She touched the goats' foreheads. She laid her hand on the iron latch of the blacksmith's door. She sat beside the baker's son, who had not spoken in 2 summers, and whispered to him until he laughed. The people did not stop her. They felt, without understanding, that she was not changing things. She was uncovering them. Eric followed her sometimes, though he did not hover. He watched how she listened to the stones, how she tapped the trees once with her knuckles and waited for them to answer. He saw her walk into the stream up to her knees, close her eyes, and hum so low the minnows floated closer to her calves as though drawn by gravity. And every night, the dreams changed again. No longer stories, not visions, not symbols. Now the dreams came as knowing. A woman dreamed of a memory she never lived, giving birth beneath the ash tree, while wolves circled the grove in silence, watching not to harm, but to witness. A fisherman dreamed of dying, not with fear, but with gratitude, because the sea opened its arms to him, and in its embrace was the face of his grandfather, smiling. Eric himself dreamed of walking backward through his own footprints until he reached the first moment of breath, and there, beside the newborn version of himself, sat the girl, waiting. In the morning, the pouch that had once carried the 5th rune was gone. Not lost. Gone. In its place, a small stone had appeared, not carved, not shaped, not marked, but smooth and silent. Eric touched it and felt a stillness that went beyond sleep. The girl stood in the doorway. "You don't need to carry them anymore," she said. "The runes have already gone home." He turned the stone in his fingers. "Then what am I?" "You are the silence that follows." He nodded, not in understanding, but in welcome. That afternoon, the villagers gathered without being told, not in ceremony, not in fear, in alignment. They sat together on stones, along paths, beside trees and rooftops, and let the stillness pass through them like wind through open hands. And the 6th rune moved among them. It was not seen. It was felt. In the way a mother reached for her child without looking. In the way a dog turned its head before thunder arrived. In the way every person, young and old, paused for one breath longer than needed, and knew. The 6th rune was the one that asked for nothing and gave clarity in return. That evening, the girl stood at the center of the village and whispered to the fire. The flames rose once, swayed left, then right, then settled. In that movement, everyone saw a shape they could not describe, but each would remember it differently and completely. The girl looked to Eric. "Will you come with me?" He did not ask where. He only asked, "For how long?" She smiled. "Until the next silence." He turned once to Solveig, who stood in the doorway of their longhouse. She raised her hand, and that was enough. The next morning, the 2 of them walked east, following the stream, its direction unchanged since the beginning. And behind them, Skjoldheim breathed. The villagers did not mark their leaving with song or prayer or stone. They simply woke the next day and listened. When all names fall quiet, when symbols no longer cling to things, when the world becomes a shape without edges, there is a peace in that, a letting go. Like the pause after a question that doesn't need answering. Breathe into that space tonight. Let it carry you gently along the stream where Eric and the girl now walk, between breath and silence, between knowing and not knowing. They did not speak much as they walked. There was no need. The land had softened since they left Skjoldheim. The wind no longer pressed against their backs, nor blew in their faces. It simply moved beside them, quiet as a sleeping animal. The stream, which had first turned east in spring, now widened and slowed, its banks stitched with wildflowers, its voice hushed into a constant murmur. They did not follow a path, but neither were they lost. Wherever the stream bent, they bent with it. By the third day, they began to feel something underfoot, not quite a vibration, but a rhythm, as though the earth was breathing beneath them, and the rhythm had once had a name, now forgotten. Eirik felt it behind his ribs. The girl felt it in the soles of her feet, and neither of them asked aloud what it meant, because some things, once spoken, shrink. At dusk, they made camp near a grove where the trees had no bark, only skin, pale, thin, like the surface of a still lake. When Eirik touched one, it gave a little beneath his fingers. He pulled away with reverence. The girl sat nearby, weaving something out of reed and air. He couldn't see the shape of it, only the intention. "Do you remember your name?" she asked after a long time. He nodded. "Yes." "Do you use it?" He shook his head. She smiled. "That's when it begins to return." That night, he did not dream, but he woke with a song in his mouth. One he didn't know, one he couldn't sing. The melody folded in on itself like braided light, and when he hummed it under his breath, the trees around them leaned slightly inward, as if listening. By the seventh day, the stream vanished, not into the earth, not into mist. It simply thinned, the way breath thins in the cold, until it's no longer seen but still felt. And when they looked back, the footprints they'd left had already faded. They entered a field of stones then, flat, warm, scattered like forgotten prayers. Each stone hummed faintly, as if the sunlight itself had tuned them to a deeper chord. The girl stopped and placed her palms on two of the stones. "Here," she whispered. "This is where the seventh begins." Eirik crouched beside her. "Have you seen it?" he asked. "I've been it," she said. She closed her eyes. The seventh rune is not spiral, not sound, not breath. What is it? She opened her eyes. It is unmaking. A stillness passed over them. Not the silence of sleep, but the stillness of listening to something that has not yet decided whether it wants to be heard. The stones around them began to hum lower. The grass wilted. The air warmed. And the world felt, for a moment, like it was holding its breath. Not in anticipation, but in memory. "The seventh is where things forget their names," she said. "Not to disappear, but to rest." Eirik nodded. Somehow, he already knew. They stayed in that field for 3 nights. Each night, a different animal came. First, an old white fox with one blind eye. It sat across from their fire and blinked slowly, its body so still it barely seemed to breathe. When Eirik offered it food, it vanished. Second, a crane with one leg tucked, its feathers streaked with soot. It circled above them at dusk, then vanished into the stars. Third, a doe, heavy with child, limping slightly. She approached just after midnight, looked directly into the girl's eyes, then lay down beside their fire and slept. She was gone by morning. Each creature left nothing behind, except the air, which by the 4th morning carried a scent Eirik could not name. It was not ash, not rain, not soil. It was before all of those. The girl stood and placed her reed weaving upon the largest stone. Only now did he see what it was. Not a basket, not a net, not a knot. It was a vessel shaped like a question mark. He understood without asking. The seventh rune could not be held, only offered. They left the stone field quietly. The land grew stranger. The trees no longer held leaves, but glowed softly from within, not with fire, but with memory. Some whispered as they passed, though the words were not for them. Once, Eric thought he heard his father's voice. Another time, the girl stopped, turned to a tree, and bowed. "I was born here," she said. "Beneath that tree? Number from it?" He looked up at the smooth trunk, pulsing gently. "What does that make you?" he asked. She touched the tree with the back of her hand. "A listening?" They camped near a hollow that night, not unlike the one in Skjoldheim, though the stones here bore no markings, only scars, as if runes had once been carved and later forgotten, not erased, but released. Eric lay on the ground with his eyes open, staring into the night sky. The stars pulsed in spirals, some reversed direction, others blinked out and reappeared in different places. When he blinked, he saw lines between them, not constellations, but paths, not roads for gods or birds, but for memory. The girl lay beside him. "Do you think we'll return?" he asked softly. "To the village?" He nodded. "Perhaps. And if we don't?" She closed her eyes. "Then the village will become a dream. One that walks without feet, one that speaks through hands, one that remembers its own silence." He thought of Solveig then, of the fire, of the runes once carved into his breath, of the stream before it had a name, and he smiled. The seventh rune was not loss. It was return, without path, without form, just being. They slept, not in sleep. They breathed, not in breath. And the world turned quietly, without edge. The earth holds stories no one has told in centuries, not written in words nor carved in stone, but pressed into root and wind, into the hush between bird calls, into the spaces where moss grows undisturbed. Settle into one of those spaces now. Let the hush carry you to the place where paths begin to loosen, where time forgets its order, and where Eric walks quietly beside a girl born from a tree that remembers. The forest had deepened, not in shadow, but in quiet, the kind of quiet that had no center, because it pressed from every side. The trees here did not creak, did not drop leaves. They stood still, their bark pale and pulsing gently, like breath beneath the surface of skin. Eric walked without speaking. He did not know how long it had been since they left Skjoldheim. Days folded into one another. Nights passed like water, soft, cool, and always moving. The girl, the one with river grass in her hair and silence in her eyes, walked a little ahead now. Not far, never too far. But she no longer looked back. She didn't need to. He was still following. Sometimes she would stop and place her palm against a tree, or run her fingers through a patch of moss. Once, she reached down and lifted a single pebble from the earth, held it to her lips, then placed it back. She did not explain. She didn't need to. Eric was beginning to understand things without needing the shape of explanation. The seventh rune had changed him. Not suddenly, not with force, but in layers, like sediment laid gently across the years. He no longer dreamed in images. He dreamed in textures. Rough bark, warm breath, the heaviness of snow before it falls. One morning, they came to a clearing. It was not remarkable in any way. No stone circle, no strange light. Just a wide bowl of grass and soil, where the trees had stopped growing as if they had agreed to leave a space open. But when Eric stepped into it, he stopped breathing. Not because something frightened him, because something recognized him. The clearing did not whisper, it remembered. And in that remembering, he felt himself become. The girl turned to face him for the first time in many days. Her voice was soft, the way ashes fall through the air. This is where the spiral ends. He looked at the grass beneath his feet. Nothing marked it. No symbols, no bones, no flame, only earth. He opened his mouth to speak, but no question came. Instead, a hum rose in his throat, a tone he didn't recognize, but had always known. The girl stepped aside, and Eric knelt. He placed both palms flat against the ground and bowed his head until it touched the soil. The moment he did, the silence deepened. The air slowed, and something below him stirred. Not a creature, not a voice, but a memory. One so old it had forgotten how to speak. It did not rise with force. It didn't need to. It rose with recognition. And Eric, with his hands in the soil, his spine curved like a branch in winter, listened. The memory was not words. It was not even feeling. It was shape. The shape of a time before time, when runes were not carved but lived. The shape of people who sang their thoughts into stone and folded dreams into the bellies of trees. The shape of loss that wasn't pain, only distance. And within that shape was a question. But it wasn't asked. It was offered. Would you carry what we forgot? Eric did not answer with words. He pressed his forehead deeper into the soil and wept, quietly, not from sadness, but from homecoming. When he finally looked up, the girl had moved to the far side of the clearing. She stood with her back to him, arms slightly raised, as if catching wind in her sleeves. Around her, the grass bent in slow spirals, not away from her, but toward. She turned her head slightly, enough to be heard, but not seen. There is one more? One more what? Eric whispered. Rune. He felt the breath catch in his throat. The 8th? He asked. She nodded. But I've only known 7. You've only named 7. He stood slowly, his hands dirty, his knees wet with soil. How do I find the 8th? She turned to him now, and in her eyes was a stillness so complete it nearly stilled the sky. You don't, she said. It finds you. That night they did not light a fire. The stars were bright enough, and something about the clearing asked not for warmth, but for witness. They lay in silence, their backs to the earth, the sky unblinking above them. And the spiral, the one that had followed Eric since he was a boy, beneath the wolf moon, turned one last time. But this time, it did not tighten. It unwound, unraveled, not into chaos, into return. He dreamed, if it can be called that, of standing on a shoreline where every grain of sand had a name, not given by people, but by the wind. And each name was a breath, and each breath was a story, and each story led home. And at the center of that shoreline, buried beneath the oldest stone, was the 8th rune. Not a mark, not a shape, but a soundless question that asked only this: are you ready to become the thing you once sought? There is a silence that listens back, not the stillness of emptiness, but the kind that waits with awareness, like a shoreline before a tide, or the hush in a room just after someone speaks a truth too deep to echo. Let yourself rest in that silence now. Let it surround you as the dream turns once more. The spiral is undone, and something older begins to breathe beneath it. When Eric opened his eyes, dawn had not yet broken. The sky above was pale with promise, but still untouched by light. The clearing around him held its hush like a held breath. Dew clung to the blades of grass and to the small ridges of his knuckles where he had pressed into the soil the night before. The girl was gone. Not far. That he knew. She had always been more presence than figure, a thread in the world's own breath. And though he couldn't see her, he could feel the echo of her footsteps on the earth, as if she had walked ahead just moments before, and the land was still remembering her weight. He stood slowly, listening, not for sound, for invitation. The eighth rune had not yet appeared to him, not in image, not in symbol. But he felt it, hovering near the edge of thought. Not something to be summoned, but to be recognized. He had become a vessel once, then a listener. Now he would become a mirror. He walked to the center of the clearing again, where the grass had curled inward slightly from where he had knelt the night before. The spiral was gone, not erased, simply absorbed. The earth had taken it back, and in doing so, had made space. He sat cross-legged now, hands on his knees, palms open to the air, and waited. The light changed, not suddenly, but in layers. Shadows slipping away, warmth gently brushing against the side of his face, the scent of thawed earth beginning to rise. Then from beyond the tree line, a sound, software subtle, not music, not speech, a rhythm, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He opened his eyes, not startled, not searching, but because the world had just blinked, and in the space between the trees, where before there had only been mist, the girl returned. She was carrying something, not in her arms, around her, a silence deeper than any he had yet felt, the kind of silence one finds inside a bell just before it's rung. She stepped into the clearing and her eyes met his, not in greeting, in confirmation. She knelt across from him. Between them, she placed a smooth stone, darker than night, flat and round, humming faintly. And upon it, nothing. No mark, no carving, just presence. She did not speak, but he heard her. This is the eighth. It does not name. It does not bind. It does not hold. It receives. He reached for the stone, not with hand, but with awareness, and it responded, not by changing, not by glowing, but by remembering him, his dreams, his silences, his not quite questions, his years of listening. It remembered the village that taught him to be quiet, the mother who whispered rules into her braids, the seeress who spoke in riddles beneath moonless skies, the girl who stepped from a tree without roots. And it folded all of that, all of him, into itself, and still did not change. Because the eighth rune did not exist to transform. It existed to witness, and Eric had become its mirror. Tears rose, not from sorrow, but from release. He reached out at last, fingers brushing the stone, and a breath moved through the clearing. Not wind, not air, memory. Something vast and silent and whole passed through him. Not into him, through him. He saw the rune now, not on the stone, but in everything. The bend of the grass, the curve of the girl's shoulder, the distant cry of a bird circling far above. He saw it in the riverbed, in the braid of smoke rising from a village hearth he had not seen in many days. He saw it in the palm of his own hand, not drawn there, not etched, but belonging. And in that moment, he understood. The eighth rune was not a thing to know. It was the knowing itself. The girl spoke now, aloud, for the first time in many nights. Her voice was soft, but clear. When you return, she said, you won't carry anything. Eric nodded. I know. Not even your name. He smiled. Especially not that. She stood. And as she walked away, The earth around her seemed to fold into silence, not because she erased it, but because she fulfilled it. He sat for a long time, not in thought, in stillness, until the sun rose fully, and the clearing became only a field again. He stood, turned toward the west, and began to walk. The path did not appear, but his feet moved with certainty, not because he remembered the way, but because the way remembered him. He did not hurry. He did not pause. And as he moved, the 8th rune moved with him. Not before, not behind, not within, but through. When he reached the first bend in the hills, he looked back. The clearing was gone, but the silence remained. There's a kind of return that doesn't feel like coming back. Not because things have changed, but because you have. The trees still stand. The smoke still rises. But the quiet inside your chest carries a different weight now, like water, after it has learned how to reflect. Tonight, settle into that quiet. Let it carry you westward, where the village once known as Skjoldheim waits, not as it was, but as it is becoming. Eric did not mark the days as he walked. He didn't need to. The world moved differently now. The trees no longer whispered from a distance. They breathed beside him. The soil beneath his boots no longer crunched with each step. It listened. And the birds, oh, the birds, they no longer scattered at his passing. They flew in slow, wide arcs, like sentries moving through time. The hills that once rose steep and distant now seemed to slope toward him gently, as if welcoming. Even the wind had lost its urgency. No longer a push or pull, but a presence. It moved beside him like an old friend who did not need to speak. And always the 8th rune walked through him. He felt it when he touched a branch without breaking it, when he crossed a stream without disturbing a ripple, when he woke each morning without the sense of having left anything behind in sleep. The dreams still came, but they no longer told stories. They listened. And in those listening dreams, Eric heard voices, not in words, but in rhythm. Solveig stirring a pot, Bjarki sharpening his blade, Audun's mother tying knots in cord with calloused fingers. They were all still there, inside the pulse of the land. When the village came into view at last, it was just as he remembered, and not at all. The rooftops leaned a little softer now, like they had been exhaling while he was gone. The smoke from the chimneys curled upward, then back toward the ground. The stream, once a thin blue line beyond the fields, now shimmered gold in the late light, as if it carried not just water, but memory. And people were outside, not working, not waiting, simply being. He approached without ceremony, and no one ran to meet him, but no one turned away. Solveig was seated by the longhouse, hands resting in her lap, a small basket of unspun wool beside her. When she saw him, she did not rise. She simply smiled, the kind of smile that accepts a truth already known. He stood before her for a moment, then knelt, and laid both hands in the dirt. No words passed between them. None were needed. The silence held them. Behind him, the villagers gathered slowly. Old Bjarka leaned on his staff. The baker wiped flour from her apron. Children peeked from behind legs and shoulders. The blacksmith's new apprentice, not the one who vanished, but another, even younger, stood barefoot, a length of twine looped through his fingers like a half-formed net. And then, as if guided by a signal no one heard, they all sat, in the dust, in the grass, on stone, on wood. They sat and waited. Eric looked up. "I have no rune to give you." No one moved. "I have no name to speak." No one blinked. I brought no vision, no fire, no blade. A breeze passed through the village, light, cool, full of the scent of stone and soaproot. Eric closed his eyes. What I carry now, he said softly, is not mine. And it never was. And then he reached into the space in front of him, not into a pouch, not into cloth, but into the silence. And from it, he lifted his hands, empty, open. The village exhaled, not in sound, in knowing. The children were the first to move. One stood and walked toward him. A girl, no more than 8 summers, with straw in her hair and dirt on her knees. She placed something in his lap, a shell, ridged and broken, bleached white by time. He smiled. Another child brought a feather. A third, a small sprig of dried mint. Soon his lap filled with offerings, not valuable, not rare, but true, carried from pockets and hands and folds of cloth. Things once held quietly, now returned without question. Solveig stood. She walked slowly to him and knelt beside the growing mound of small gifts. From beneath her shawl, she withdrew a stone. Flat, warm, familiar. The spiral was gone from its surface. Only a smoothness remained. She placed it atop the pile, and Eric whispered, "Thank you for remembering." She looked at him then, with eyes that had seen too many winters to pretend. "We didn't remember," she said. "We listened." A murmur moved through the people, not voices, not sound, just breath. As one, they stood and walked away, not from him, but into the moment, back to their doorways, their nets, their fields. Some walked with linked hands, others alone. A few remained, not to witness, but to settle. Eric sat until the sun touched the mountains. And when the sky turned the color of old milk, he rose. He did not gather the gifts. He left them there, in the dirt, to be reclaimed by wind and root and dusk. The 8th rune was not to be kept. It was to be shared. That night, the fire in the longhouse burned without wood, not in flame, but in presence. No one asked where he had gone. No one asked what he had seen. Instead, Solveig poured him broth, and they sat together on the floor, feet bare against the packed earth. After a long while, she said, "You'll go again." He nodded. "Will it be far?" "No," he said, "just through." And she smiled, not because she understood, but because she didn't have to. He slept without dreams, but the silence was full. And when the morning came, the village had already begun to move in rhythm again. Children chased chickens. Water steamed from pots. And above it all, somewhere near the ashwood, a single bird sang a note without tune. The kind of note that doesn't begin. It returns. There are some doors you walk through only once. And then there are the others, the ones that were never closed to begin with, the ones you pass by every day and do not notice, because they do not open with sound, but with attention. Let yourself drift toward one of those doors now. Let the world blur at its edges. Let time loosen its grasp. You are not leaving. You are remembering the way back in. The morning after his return, Eric rose before the light did. The village stirred softly in its sleep. Smoke drifting from a few early hearths, chickens scratching faintly under thatch. But the loudness of waking hadn't begun. There was still room for silence. Still room for the 8th rune to stretch. He left without cloak or pouch. No knife at his side. No staff in hand. The wind did not follow, because he was not leaving again. He was listening. There was a path beyond the edge of Skjoldheim that no one used anymore. Not because it was lost, it had never been hidden, but because it went nowhere in particular. It followed the tree line east, then curved softly northward, before vanishing into a thicket where the stream used to bend, before it turned and never turned back. Eric took it, not to seek, not to wander, to trace. The earth remembered him. He felt it in the give of the moss underfoot, the soft resistance of the branches that moved just enough for him to pass. The birds did not startle. The deer in the distance did not scatter. The trees did not lean. They simply watched. After some time, he couldn't say how much, he came to a hollow. Not the grove from before. Not the one with the carved stone, where runes had whispered in breath and shadow. This place was different. It held no shape, no center, no clearing, only space, like something had once been held here and had left its form behind. He stepped into it, and everything stilled. Not froze, not waited. Stilled, as if the world had remembered what it had once been. Breath, rhythm, thread. He sat, not to rest, to offer. He placed his hands on his knees again, as he had in the clearing. But this time, there was no question in his heart, only presence. And in that presence, the ninth came. It did not announce itself. It did not appear. It was already there. It did not hum like the others. It did not spiral, or echo, or unfold. It settled, soft as the moment after a story ends, and the listener still lingers in its warmth. Eric did not try to see it. He did not try to carry it. Because the ninth rune could not be carried. It could only be joined. He understood now, not through thought, not through word, through recognition. He had become many things on this journey. A boy, born under the wolf moon. A vessel, for dreams too old to speak. A mirror for silence. A thread woven back into the cloth. But the ninth rune, it was none of these, and all of them. It was the place between, where runes do not wait to be drawn, where meaning exists before language, where the spiral begins again, not forward, not backward, but inward. He stayed there for some time, eyes closed, hands still, listening to the hush beneath the bird's song, the breath beneath the wind. When he rose, nothing had changed, and everything had. He stepped from the hollow, and the earth gave a little beneath his feet, like the page of a book being turned. The trees remained. The moss remained. But the path behind him had softened, not erased, but folded, as if to say, it is not the path you walked, but the path that now walks through you. He returned to Skjoldheim, just as the sun touched the rooftops. People looked up as he passed, not with curiosity, not with expectation, with knowing. They nodded. He nodded. The children did not ask where he'd gone. They simply held out their palms, and he touched each one lightly, as if leaving behind not a blessing, but a reminder, a warmth that would find its shape in time. That evening, Solveig sat by the hearth, a bowl of root stew steaming in her lap. She looked up at him and said only, "Did it settle?" He nodded. "It always does," she said. They ate in silence, and when the fire crackled down to coals and the stars blinked slow above them, she said one more thing. "You'll teach them, won't you?" He looked at the children, curled in sleep near the far wall. A small girl had her hand resting on a carved bit of bone. Another held a pouch of feathers beneath her cheek like a charm. "I won't teach," he said softly. "I'll remember with them." Solveig smiled. That's all the ninth ever asks. That night, the fire did not go out, and neither did the silence. They lived beside each other, like breath and heartbeat, like sleep and story. And somewhere in the distance, not far, not near, a tree unfurled a new root, searching for something it already knew. Some threads are pulled, some are tied. But the oldest threads do not begin with hands. They begin in silence. They begin where meaning first leans toward form, before the knot, before the song, before even the breath that names it. Tonight, let yourself feel one of those threads. You do not need to hold it. Only let it rest beside you, and it will begin to weave. Eirik no longer walked with intention. He walked with presence. The days unfolded gently, the way parchment curls beside a fire. Not quickly, not with force, but because it must. He moved through the village like a rhythm, like something known but not spoken. He helped with nets. He listened to the stream. He watched the crows settle on the smokehouse roof each dusk and leave in spirals at dawn. He no longer dreamed. He remembered. But what he remembered had no shape, only pattern. There was a weaving now, not of thread, not of cord, but of moments. A child falling asleep in the warmth of his shadow. The old blacksmith humming a forgotten tune while shaping a blade that no one had asked for. Solveig whispering to the wind just before the storm arrived, and the wind shifting in response. It wasn't that things had changed. It was that they had unfolded. Skjoldheim had softened. And in that softening, the threads of the village began to reveal their pattern. One afternoon, Eirik sat on the ridge above the northern field, where goats grazed in the half-light and thistles nodded in rhythm with the bees. Beside him sat Jora, a boy of maybe 11 winters, with a loud laugh and dirt always under his nails. Jora held a flat stone in his hands. "I dreamed something," he said, without preamble. Eirik looked at him, but said nothing. "It wasn't a place," Jora continued. "It was like a feeling that made shapes." Eirik tilted his head. "What kind of shapes?" "Not ones I know. But they felt like they were supposed to be here." The boy placed the stone down. "I drew one with my finger when I woke up. Just on the wall. It's gone now." Eirik nodded slowly. "Do you want to remember it?" he asked. Jora looked up. "I think I already do." Eirik smiled. "Then let it come back when it wants to. Don't tug on it." The boy grinned and leaned against his shoulder. After a moment, he said, "Is that what you do now? Remember shapes?" Eirik looked out over the fields. "No," he said. "I wait until they remember me." That night, he sat by the fire alone. Solveig had gone to sleep early, and the children had curled near the hearth like cats, arms slung over each other in the easy sleep of those who trust the dark. He stirred the embers with a stick, and something moved behind his ribs. Not a thought, not a word, a nudge. So he rose, barefoot, and stepped outside. The moon was low, caught in a net of clouds, its light silver and thin. The wind moved like a long breath, carrying with it the scent of charred bark and cold earth. He followed it, not with steps, with listening. It led him beyond the old grain stones, past the drying racks where fish still hung, through the edge of the forest where branches never broke, they only opened. There, in a small circle of ash trees, stood the girl. Not the same girl, but the shape of her, as if she had returned not with feet, but with presence. She wore no cloak, no thread, only the night. He did not speak. He did not need to, because she was not there to speak. She was there to complete. They stood in silence. And in that silence, something began to hum. Low, distant, like a tone from the bones of the mountain. She raised her hand. Eirik raised his. And between them, in the air, the thread began to appear. Not a rope, not a line, a living shape. A thread that moved on its own, circling, spiraling, folding into itself and then opening again. It was not a rune. It was what the rune becomes when no one tries to understand it. The thread moved to Eric's chest and sank in. He did not flinch. It did not hurt. It entered like warmth after cold, like light behind closed eyes. And when it vanished, he was left not with power, but with pattern. He saw it everywhere. In the bend of the river, in the soot on Solveig's cheek when she slept, in the knot Jorah had tied around his wrist without realizing it formed a perfect loop. He returned to the longhouse. The fire had not died, and the children still breathed in unison. He sat down and whispered, "It's begun." No one heard, but the house knew. In the following days, the weaving came to life. Children began to braid grasses in strange ways that fit no tradition, yet held meaning. The elder fishermen began humming in spirals, not tunes, just patterns that made people stop and feel calmer without knowing why. Someone carved a hollow into a log and placed stones inside, then said it made the night sleep longer. No one questioned these things, because they weren't changes. They were rememberings. One evening, Jorah came running with a piece of bark. "Look," he said, panting. "It showed up this morning. I didn't carve it." Eric turned the bark in his hand. There, faint but deep, was a spiral, unfinished. "It's not done," Jorah said. "It's not supposed to be," Eric replied. He handed it back, and Jorah smiled like someone who'd just been trusted with a secret not meant for keeping. That night, Eric dreamed again, but not as before. He did not see. He became a river folding into sky, a root pushing into rock, a hand placed gently on a forehead just before the last breath. The thread wove him in and out of these things, not to teach, not to test, but to say, "You are part of it now." When he woke, he whispered a word he did not know he knew. And the wind repeated it, not aloud, but in everything. Some things are never said aloud, not because they are secret, but because they are sacred. The kind of knowing that sits beneath the tongue, soft as moss, firm as old wood. Tonight, let that kind of knowing find you. Let it curl beneath your ribs. Let it hum in the quiet between your thoughts. For what follows now is not a new story, but the remembering of a pattern that always waited for your return. The word that came to Eirik as he woke had no meaning in the spoken tongue, but it felt familiar. It felt like something whispered to a newborn just before their first breath. Something stitched into the silence before storms. Something older than the runes, older than the dream hall, older even than the ash tree whose roots once drank the bones of gods. He didn't say it again. He didn't need to. That morning, as the village stirred, Eirik stood outside the longhouse and watched as Solveig untied the drying herbs from their wooden beam. She moved slowly, deliberately, fingers nimble even in age. She didn't look up as she spoke. "You said it, didn't you?" He nodded. She didn't ask what the word was. She didn't have to. Instead, she turned to him and placed a small bundle of thistle and pine into his hands. "Then it's time." "For what?" Solveig smiled, but it was not the smile of someone amused. It was the smile of someone ready to show them. The children came first, of course. They always did. Not because they were told, no one ever told them, but because they felt the shift before anyone else did. They arrived at the edge of the field with blades of grass in their fists, feathers in their braids, smudges of soot on their cheeks. They sat in a circle, legs crossed, eyes wide. Jorah brought the bark with the spiral again. Now it had deepened, as if the wood had continued the carving while he slept. Then came the mothers, carrying baskets of soft cloth, bowls of unspun flax, arms folded loosely. Then the elders, leaning on walking sticks but walking steadily. Then the men, some still smelling of fish, some with dirt beneath their nails, some with eyes that had stopped expecting wonder a long time ago, and now remembered they didn't form a perfect circle, because nothing living does. They sat in the shape that made itself around Eirik, a soft, irregular spiral. He didn't stand in the center. He sat with them, and in the middle, the wind stirred a small swirl of leaves, dry, golden, whispering. He looked at each of them, one by one, not searching, recognizing. This, he said gently, is not a teaching. No one moved. This is a remembering. He reached into his pocket and drew out nothing, held it up, and let the silence name it. There have always been runes, he said, but not the ones we carved, not the ones we buried. A few elders glanced at one another. He continued, the oldest runes are not marks. They are movements. Breath, thread, firelight on water. A small girl raised her hand. He nodded to her. What is a rune that can't be drawn? She asked. Eric smiled softly. It's the one that draws you. That evening, they lit no central fire. Instead, each household burned its own, 100 small flames casting shadows that danced together across the grass. And from each fire came a sound. Not words, not chants, but rhythm. Tapping, humming, stirring. The people had begun to make their own patterns again. The weaving had returned, not taught, joined. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Not suddenly, but certainly. People began to speak their dreams again. Even the ones that made no sense. Even the ones that frightened them. They whispered them into boiling pots. They hummed them into goat fur. They painted them with clay on the undersides of bowls. They let them live. And with that, the dreams stopped haunting. They started holding. One morning, a boy woke to find his arm tattooed in pollen. Another, an elder, claimed that the tree in her yard had begun growing downward, its roots reaching into the sky. The baker's wife no longer burned her bread, and Bjarka, old Bjarka, laughed for the first time in 2 winters. Eirik watched it all unfold without trying to guide it, because it did not need guiding. The pattern already knew where it was going. And then, one twilight, he stood at the stream again. The same stream that had once turned east, unbidden. Now it ran in both directions, forking gently, one arm flowing west toward the sea, the other curling eastward into the grove. He reached down, cupped the water in both hands, and held it to his chest. The water was warm, not because of the sun, but because it had learned him. He whispered the word again, the one from his dream, the one that didn't mean anything, but remembered everything. And as the sound left his mouth, he saw something shimmer across the surface of the stream, a shape, not drawn, not named, only known. He turned, and the girl was there, not the one from the grove, not the one born of the 6th rune, but another, younger, smaller. She held a piece of uncut cloth in one hand, a basket of stones in the other. She walked up to him without hesitation, handed him the cloth, then the stones. No words, only eyes. And in those eyes was the same question he had once asked of the fire, of the hall, of the stone and the ashwood. Why me? He didn't need to speak it aloud, because now he knew the answer, not because it had been given, but because he had become it. The rune was no longer something he carried. It was something that carried him. He knelt, laid the cloth upon the grass, poured the stones atop it, and began to weave, Not a message, not a sign, a pattern, one that would never be finished, because it was never meant to be. There is a kind of weaving that doesn't stop once the hands fall still, a pattern that continues on its own, through wind, through water, through the echo left behind by a footstep. Tonight, let yourself drift into that pattern. Feel it hum beneath your skin. Let the story move through you now, not as a listener, but as a thread already placed. Eric did not know how long he sat there, weaving the stones into the cloth. Time had softened again, losing its edges, folding itself quietly between his breaths. The cloth was coarse, and the stones, each one no bigger than a thumb, were unmarked, uncut, untouched by any chisel or fire, and yet they knew what to become. He placed them without thinking, one by one, side by side, then apart again. He was not creating an image. He was revealing a memory. Because this was not his first weaving. It was simply the first one his hands had joined. He had been part of the pattern long before he ever touched it. And the child, the girl with the basket, sat beside him in silence, watching, not in awe, not in confusion, but in familiarity, as if she had done this before, many times, in dreams that had not yet been dreamt. When the last stone fell into place, a simple, round one, soft gray, with a stripe of yellow, like sun caught in fog, the cloth lifted, not by wind, by recognition. It rose gently from the earth, fluttered once, then lay still again. But something had shifted. The grass around it now grew in a spiral. The stream, still running in both directions, hummed a lower note. The sky, soft with dusk, glowed slightly blue at its edges, not from the sun, but from something else, something inside the land waking. Eric looked at the girl. She met his eyes, and nodded once. No words, only rhythm. That night, the village did not sleep, but neither did it stay awake. Instead, it entered something between. Each person, child, elder, goat herder, potter, widow, found themselves pausing at some point after sunset, stilling whatever they were doing, and feeling woven. A pause at the edge of stirring porridge, a stillness before the last log was placed on the fire, a breath taken just before speaking, and not spoken. And in that breath, the 9th rune passed among them, not as fire, not as sound, as presence. Some wept, some laughed quietly, others said nothing at all. But they all knew, in their own quiet ways, that something had returned, or rather, that something they had always carried had remembered its shape. Eric, for his part, sat again at the ridge the next morning. Jorah found him there, twine still wrapped around one wrist. "There's something new in the dreams," the boy said. Eric nodded, waiting. "They don't start with me anymore," Jorah whispered. "I'm entering them, like they're already happening, and I'm just arriving." Eric reached for the boy's wrist and gently unwrapped the twine, held it in both hands, tied it into a loose knot, then slipped it over his own fingers. "They're not dreams," he said. "They're patterns." Jorah looked down at his hands. "Are they mine?" "They're ours," Eric replied, "but they'll wear your name when needed." Later that day, the wind returned, strong this time, from the north. It carried with it the scent of cedar and salt and something more distant, ash, not from destruction, from transformation. The villagers gathered near the longhouse, not summoned, not called. They arrived the way embers gather, drawn by warmth, not command. And Solveig stood before them, cloak loose, hair unbraided for the first time in seasons. She looked older and brighter, like someone who had finally laid down the last bundle she was never meant to carry. Eric joined her, and together they stood in silence until the hush deepened. Then Solveig said, "The time of holding is done." No one questioned it, because the pattern had already spoken. "The threads are loose," she continued, "as they should be. You must not try to make a knot of them again. You must let them move." And they did. In the weeks that followed, no festival was planned, but one happened anyway. It began when a group of children placed their dream stones in the center of the village square, then danced around them in a slow, off-rhythm circle. Then someone began to sing, not a song anyone remembered, but one that sounded like it had always been sung. Then food was brought out, not arranged, not laid, just offered. And people ate with their fingers, and their breath, and their listening. That night, no one returned to the longhouses. They slept in the open. The sky had no clouds. The stars flickered in spirals. And somewhere far off, or perhaps very near, a river changed direction again. In his sleep, Eric felt the thread shift once more. He was not frightened. He was not surprised. He simply reached out, not with hand, but with presence, and touched the next turn in the pattern. And it welcomed him. There are stories that close softly, like the turning of a page before sleep. But some stories do not close. They open inward, again and again, like breath, like tide, like the hush that settles over a village just before dawn. Tonight, we come to such a moment. The spiral does not tighten now. It unfolds, not to finish, but to continue, in silence, in pattern, in you. Eric stirred before the sun rose. The night had been deep, dreamless, and complete. Not empty, never empty, but full of that quiet fullness that comes after a long song is ended and no one moves, not even to clap. That space where meaning hangs like mist, neither asking nor offering, just being. He sat up slowly. Around him, the village lay quiet and breathing. Children still wrapped in sleep. Elders curled like roots in the grass. The embers of the communal fire pulsed gently in the center of it all, breathing light into the blue dark air. The cloth was still there. So were the stones. But something had changed. They no longer waited. They watched. He stood and walked toward them. And there, beside the cloth, lay a spiral of footprints. Small, unshod, moving outward, not away, but through. Jorah stood just beyond the circle, arms crossed, the same twine now tied around his ankle. "You felt it too?" the boy asked. Eric nodded. "It's not the end, is it?" "No," he said. "It never was." They walked the path together, not toward the grove, not toward the mountain, but toward the old place beyond the stream, where the bark had first held the forbidden rune. But this time, the bark was not forbidden. It had bloomed. Tiny green shoots rose from the carved place, soft and fragrant, unfurling like fingers long stiff with silence. At the base of the stone, water now pooled, not from rain, not from spring, from remembering. The 9th rune lived there now, not drawn, not spoken, only reflected, in the shape of the moss, in the tilt of the root, in the pause of a breath taken before naming something and deciding not to. The others joined them slowly, one by one, then in pairs, then in gentle murmuring waves, not to witness, to weave. No pattern was taught, no shape assigned. They brought what they carried: feathers, threads, breath, songs with no words, bread baked from flour milled at dusk. And Eric said nothing, because this moment did not belong to speech. It belonged to the seam, where one world touches another without rupture. where the waking walks gently into the dreaming and neither disappears. That night, the stars blinked in patterns no one had seen before. Children pointed, elders nodded, and somewhere in the fields, two goats fell asleep facing each other, their breath forming mist runes in the grass. Eric sat alone beneath the ash tree, not to retreat, to root. He laid his hand on the bark, where once the warning had been whispered, never carve the dream, and smiled. It had never been about the carving. It had always been about the listening. His hand moved, slowly, gently, and he traced the space beside the old rune, not to add, to remind. Solveig came to him near dawn. She brought no bowl, no gift, only herself. She sat beside him and looked out across the village, where lamps still glowed despite the light. "You've made something," she said. Eric shook his head. "I've remembered something," he replied. She placed her palm on his shoulder. "And what now?" He turned his head slightly. "Now we forget again." She blinked, but said nothing, because she understood. To forget, in the old way, was not to lose. It was to offer, to set something down, so it could become part of the earth again, so that generations from now, someone else, a girl with river grass in her braid, a boy with twine around his wrist, could find it beneath a stone or within a breath and remember it for the first time. Eric smiled. "We forget so others can dream." He stood, and with him the wind stood too. The 9th rune shimmered in the leaves, not with light, but with motion. And the pattern, the one that had begun long before his first breath, folded once more, not closed, joined, carried, offered. There is a kind of silence at the end of all things, not empty, not final. It's the silence of a loom that still holds thread, the kind of hush that comes when a story, told gently, has laid itself down in the hearts of those listening. You do not need to follow it. You only need to rest near it, because the spiral has turned, and now it is your breath that carries it forward. Skjoldheim did not become legend. It did not disappear into the mist, or vanish from maps, or become the song of bards who never walked its fields. It simply continued. Not unchanged, but unchangeably woven into the rhythm of the land. Seasons passed, as they always do. Some winters arrived earlier than expected. Some goats bore twins. Children were born who laughed before they cried. Others grew old with quiet hearts and gave their bones back to the stream. The runes were not taught, but they were still there, in the hollows of bowls carved too smoothly to be accidental, in the way old men mark time not by moon or harvest, but by dream, in the spiral-shaped garden paths that no one claimed to have designed, and in the lullabies sung over stew, which changed slightly with each telling, but always ended in the same hush. Eric walked less. He sat more. He listened, not because there were answers to be found, but because the questions themselves were breath. Jorah grew. He began to speak less like a child, and more like one who had already returned. One spring, he asked, "How do I know if the rune is speaking to me?" Eric took a long breath. "Because you won't need to ask." They sat side by side, and Eric handed him a reed, the kind that grows where the water forgets its direction. Jorah traced a spiral in the dirt. "That's the 3rd time it's come to me this week," he whispered. Eric nodded. "Then it's not coming to you," he said. "It's coming through you." That night, the stream turned again. No one spoke of it, because they had learned the spiral does not need to be named each time it returns. Some years passed, then more. Solveig's breath grew, softer, her steps shorter, but her eyes still carried the entire sky, every star that had ever flickered in the pattern of their dreaming. On her final evening, she sat beside Eric and said, "I think I'm becoming the silence." He touched her hand. "You always were." She died just before the first frost, beneath the same ash tree where Eric had first heard the second rune whispered. They did not bury her. They wove her into soil, into bark, into wind. And the night after, the leaves along the ridge turned all at once, golden, then blue, then gently gone. Eric aged, not with loss, but with remembering. He began to speak only in gestures, a hand pressed to wood, a look held longer than necessary. A footstep paused in the middle of a path, not to avoid, but to listen. One morning, he did not rise. His breath had left in the night, so softly that even the fire did not notice. The children found him beneath the sky, a small stone in his palm. No carving, just warmth. They did not weep loudly. They gathered. They laid feathers across his chest, whispered the songs they had inherited from silence. Some placed their dreams beside him, not to give, but to share. And when the wind moved through the village that night, the goats did not stir. The hearth did not flicker, because the rune had already passed. It now lived in the center of the square, where cloth and stone still met, where no new mark was made, but where every person, one by one, began to place a hand upon the earth before they spoke. Not to ask permission, but to listen first. Years later, a child was born who dreamed of runes that hummed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She traced them in air, danced them into dirt, sang them backwards into stew pots. She laughed easily, listened deeply, and when asked what she saw in her dreams, she only said, "It's not a place, it's a pattern." They gave her no title, but the village followed her steps gently, because they recognized the weave in her wake. Because once, a boy born under the wolf moon had carried silence to the edge of a forgotten stream and remembered what could never be written. Because once, a spiral had spoken, and it had never stopped.